Okay, so we're coming to the conclusion of our discussion about Nusach HaTfilah. Obviously, there's always much more to say. We're just scratching the surface over here. But we've been building, I guess, to the point of discussing the main dispute in Nusach HaTfilah, and that's between the Chasidim and the Misnagdim. And that's the introduction of a Nusach called Nusach Sfarad, which we've touched upon already many times in the previous shiurim on this topic, on exactly what it is, but we'll try to go through it in a little more of a thorough way, and we'll see where this leads us. Now, so everybody knows that the Chasidim and the Misnagdim fought about lots of different things, but one of the major, most prominent flashpoints in the Chassidish and Misnagdish fight in the early days of the Chasidim, the second and third and maybe fourth generation of Chasidim, was about the Nusach HaSiddur, Nusach HaTfilah. Now, why is this? Because one way or another, the Chasidim introduced a new Nusach HaTfilah. Now, in a lot of the versions and the iterations that it started in, and for sure the early ones, it wasn't that different from Nusach Ashkenaz regular. There's a few minor changes, like Baruch Shamar after Haidu instead of vice versa, Yatzmach Borkani in Kaddish, Avarab and Avasailam, and some minor, variations here and there, but nothing too dramatic overall. By and large, nothing too dramatic. And according to most, it really shouldn't make an afkamina lahalacha, meaning you should be able to be yotze with either version of it. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that halachically you could just swap out whatever nusach you want for another nusach, because we know Kayidua and the Magen Avraham brings this down in Siman Samaches, and it's based on a Yerushalmi and Eruvin that says Hizaru b'minig aveisechem, and you're not supposed to change from nusach to nusach, and etc. But the nuschayos and the shirim that they were making were relatively minor, and they were introduced over a tkufa of many different years through various different siddurim. Probably the first and the most prominent Nusach Sfarad Siddur that entered the market was the Siddur Kol Yaakov to Rabbi Yaakov Couple, which was published for the first time in Slavita, which was the Chassidish Publishing House in I think 1804, and maybe the Reb Shimshon of Rashkever Siddur, and he was a Talmud of the Talmud, and etc. And there's many different Siddurim that are published, but the Baal Shem Tov Siddur Alein, which maybe if we have more time we'll discuss at the end of this, was not really such a Nusach Sfarad Siddur. The Baal Shem Tov Siddur that's in the Chabad Eitzer, item number 1 in the Chabad library, the Baal Shem Tov Siddur, I believe, has Baruch Shamar before Haidu, the way a regular Nusach Ashkenaz Siddur has it. And, so whether the Baal Shem Tov himself daven like that, a different daven like that, could be, an open tab, an open shaila, but Akapanim, the Siddur itself was not that Nusach Sfarad. Now, Stam, as a cute story, as an entry point to this discussion, so there's a famous Chassidish from the first few days of Chasidim, Shimon Yaroslaver. His father, like many of the fathers of the early Chassidim, was a Hasim Misnagid, someone who was really, really disappointed that his son became a Chassid. And on his deathbed, he called his son of Shimon Yaroslav in, and he asked him, please, if you're going to say Kaddish for me, and you're going to say V'yatzmach B'kanei, don't bother. Just skip it. Don't say Kaddish at all. Just if you can't do the Kaddish that I want, the Kaddish that's the Richtige Kaddish according to my opinion, then it's better if you don't do it at all. And if Shimon Yaroslav was masking to his father, he said, no problem, you know what, I'll say the Kaddish that you want. And his father died with a smile on his face, and allegedly he said, Oid Shimon b'ni Chai, meaning mein Zin Shimon is still alive, he's going to do the right Kaddish. Now, legend has it that Shimon Yaroslav said Kaddish without V'yatzmach B'kanei for a month, for the first month of the Shana. After a month, he went to the Chayze, and the Chayze told him, from now on, you can already say V'yatzmach B'kanei. So he asked the Chayze, what do you mean? My father told me that he doesn't. If I say V'yatzmach, I shouldn't say Kaddish at all. To which the Chayze told him, no, now your father's in Shemayim, and he knows that saying V'yatzmach B'kanei is the better way to say Kaddish. So this is like a legend of the Kilo on the importance of these Shin and Nuschayos, and these Shin and Nuschayos are like deal breakers. Now, essentially, the reason for all these various Shin and Nuschayos is to adhere more to the Kavanas of the Arizal and of Chaim Vital, and to try to make the Tefillah match up better with the Kavanas, meaning certain Tefillahs should be aligned with certain Machshavas and certain Kavanas and etc. Now, there's a reason given b'shem the Naim Elimelech, b'shem the Rebbe Melech. I have a very hard time believing that he said this, even though it's a pretty reliable source. It just seems so unverständlich to me. But in the back of the Naim Elimelech, there's some letters there from his son Rebbe Lazar, I believe. And in one of those letters there, he describes what his father said about Nusach HaTfilah and Nusach Sfarad versus Nusach Ashkenaz, and he said something to the effect of like this, that the Beis Yosef was Mesader, a Nusach HaTfilah that was perfect, Al Pi Kabbalah, because Kaidua, the Beis Yosef knew Kabbalah from the Sefer Magid Meisharim and etc. He lived in Tzfas, and he was Mesader, a perfect Nusach. But the Ramah, the Darkei Moshe, came along, and he felt that Nusach HaTfilah was not apropos for every individual who wanted to daven. It's only apropos for people who are Yodei Chein, people who really know their way around Kabbalah. And therefore the Ramah came and he changed it, and he said, no, you should daven in a way that's not so Kabbalistic, in a way that's more Shav L'chol Nefesh, and he changed it to Nusach Ashkenaz. But once the Baal Shem Tov came along, and he understood that now is a dar that could adhere to the Heilige Neschayis, to the Beis Yosef, to the Kabbalistic Neschayis, so we went back to those Kavanos of the Beis Yosef, and now we do the Tefillah like that, and that's Nusach Sfarad. Nusach Sfarad, like, so to speak, Nusach Beis Yosef. Now, this is a very, very strange pshat to say on so many levels, because first of all, as far as we know, the Beis Yosef was not the Bechadish of the Nusach in any way. The Beis Yosef davened Nusach Svaradi, Edotam Mizrach, like any Svaradi would, in maybe a particular Siddur, maybe similar to the Arizal Siddur, a Svaradi Nusach, maybe Rav Chaim Vital Siddur, Ve'aves, but he davened a regular Nusach that would have been common amongst, his Svardic brethren living in Tzfas. But as far as we know, the Ramah was not Masakin, a particular Nusach HaTfilah. The Ramah also daven Nusach Ashkenaz, regular Nusach Ashkenaz, the old style Nusach that his father and his grandfather davened, that all the Jews in his vicinity would have davened. So to say that the Beis Yosef and the Ramah were having a machlokes about how much Kabbalistic Nusach HaTfilah Kavanos should be included and incorporated in the Nusach HaTfilah is a davar rachuk. It doesn't seem like Pashut Pshat. And although this is brought down in the back of the name of the Melech in a letter from his son, it just seems like a very shvera understanding of the dispute. And the truth is that most of the later Poskesh raid, Chasidim, Litvish, and Misnagdim, whoever's writing on it back and forth, make no mention of this mahalach that's explained b'shem the name of the Melech, and they go with instead something from the name of the Melech's Rebbe, the Mizutcha Magid, which is a different Havana of understanding of the Shinoi, and that becomes a great point of contention amongst the Poskim. So let's discuss this that's brought down, gebracht in the name of the Mizutcha Magid, as a cornerstone in how the Shinoi Neschayis from Nusach Ashkenaz to Nusach Sfarad came about. So, l'chayra, the right starting point, there's a famous tshuva from the Chasam Sefer in Ar Chaim and Siman Tesvav, Tazayin really, which is addressed, Api Pashtas, to the Yismach Moshe. He's writing to the Yismach Moshe, who wrote to him about Neschayis, and he writes as follows. He says, Masha hetik ma'alasai, mi sefer likutei amarim. This that you, the Yismach Moshe, wrote to me, b'shem the sefer likutei amarim, which is the Mizurcha Magid Svar, published under different names, Magid V'rav Liakov, likutei amarim, whatever the name of the sefer was, but it's the Mizurcha Magid Svar, and it says as follows. First of all, he says, Oisei sefer le'nimtza b'kila seinu. In where I'm living, in Frankfurt, we don't have, in Pressburg probably where he's living, we don't have this sefer. Ki afilu b'shasu paiskim ki em kiyu chayenu v'erech imenu v'hem nehegi yem v'layla en li p'nai la'ayin v'achreinim ki em b'shas for Rishonim. Even ma meshas and paiskim, which is the lifeblood of us, the lifeblood of Jews, I don't have time to ma'ayin anything past the Rishonim. V'afla is a chisi l'havin divrei sefer ahu shekasav. This quote that you gave me from that sefer, you explained to me, that Nusach Svaradit, meaning Nusach Svar, the Hila B'nei Haruvis, is for the B'nei Haruvis. I don't begin to understand it. Now, what's he referencing? So he's referencing as follows, is that it's Gebrach V'Shem the Mizutcha Magid as follows. We quoted several weeks ago that the Rav Chaim Vital and Shar Kavanis writes that the Arizal said that there are more than one shar for Tefillah to go through. In fact, there are 12 sha'ar for Tefillah to go through, and it's referenced based on Psukim and Yecheskel that describe 12 different sha'arim. And the Arizal said that just like there are 12 sha'arim, we know there are 12 shvatim, and every shevet is supposed to daven in a particular manner that allows that shevet's tefillah to rise heavenward. And it goes through a particular set of sha'arim that are suitable for that shevet. Now, what's interesting is that the Arizal, as quoted by Rav Chaim Vital, uses that to bolster the point that one is never supposed to change his nusach, which is very interesting because this is going to get turned on its head in a second. But what the Arizal says is that one is never supposed to change their nusach, because the nusach that you're davening, mistama, comes for the proper nusach for your shevet. Meaning, although today we don't know what shevet we're part of, but one could presume that since you come from a family, from a locale, from a specific group of Jewish people, you can assume that the nusach you're davening matches up to the nusach that shevet belongs to, and therefore they daven that nusach. And memela, it makes sense that there should be a multiplicity of nuschayos. There shouldn't be one or two only nuschayos. There should be many nuschayos that are regional, that are familial, meaning that are based on either families or regions and etc. And there should be all these different nuschais. Mela says that Arizal, even though one nusach may seem to have malus over another nusach, you shouldn't change from nusach to nusach because each nusach is built for the people that are davening it. Now, this is interesting because this Rav Chaim Vital brings from him, and you have to understand that although Rav Chaim Vital was davening with Arizal's and Schais, as we spoke many times, Rav Chaim Vital was a Sephardi who was davening from a Sephardic Siddur, a Venetian Sephardic Siddur, and the Arizal, who was his Rebbe, had given him the proper kavanas to have as he davened. So he was not making any shinuyim. And when it comes to what Nusach the Arizal himself was davening, we've mentioned this a few times already, we don't really know. It's Yitachan that the Arizal might have been davening from a Nusach Ashkenaz Siddur. And if the Arizal was making some minor shinuyim, he was making shinuyim that he felt were an error in these nuschayos, or he was in touch with his specific sherish and neshama, and he understood exactly which nekudas needed to be modified and edited exactly, but it was personal and it was specific, and he was very much in line with this overarching theme that there needs to be different nuschayos, and the nuschayos are not supposed to be changed. And because of this basic ground level understanding of what Rav Chaim Vital is saying in the Arizal, the Magen Avram and Simon Samaches brings this and says that it's important that people should not change nuschayos. Every person should daven in the nusach that's Mesiris Avoisav, because changing it is, so to speak, running into conflict with all these deep and specific sha'arim that are built for every shevet, for every group of Klal Yisrael, for that tefillah to go up. Now comes the Mizrach Magid, and he kind of turns that on its ear, and he says the Baal Shem Tov said as follows. The Baal Shem Tov said, that was all good. This that the Arizal is talking about, and this that we say there are 12 sha'arim, and different nuschayos tefillah for different cries in Klal Yisrael, and everybody needs to stay in their lane and do their thing. That was all b'shanim kadmonius, when everyone had their proper nusach, and every shevet was al makaymai, and everybody had to daven the way they had to daven. But now that we lost track of who we are, and we don't know anymore what shevet we belong to, and we don't know which specific tefillah works for us, and which specific tefillah doesn't work for us, so came along the Baal Shem Tov, the Arshiv Hayam, and he was masakin a new nusach tefillah that would be like a catch-all that everyone from every version, from every shevet could daven, and it would do the trick. Now, the Mizrach Magid says that this was really the Arizal did this. The Arizal came and did this. And the Baal Shem Tov was just the one who instituted it for his Chasidim and for those who, Mishayme Lekche, and from his Talmidim and Talmidav. Now, we already pointed this out, that this is far from clear. As a matter of fact, it's almost impossible to prove this, that the Arizal made such a nusach that was like, a nusach for the mitzvahim, for everybody who's all confused. These nuschayos that we today know as Nusach Sfarad are much later in origin than the Arizal. They're developed, in the 17 and 1800s, and the changes were still happening deep into the 1800s, which is why there's so many various nuschayos and versions of this. It was far, far from settled. Starting, let's say, from the 1780s all the way through probably the 1850s, there's different nuschayos that are coming out, and we're not going to list every specific nusach sfarad there and all the variations and etc. But there's many variations that are still evolving and going on. So it's very hard to understand to say such a thing that the Arizal through the Baal Shem Tov, selected a specific nusach that was meant for everybody who's confused, even though the Arizal, it's like almost like in conflict, direct steer what the Arizal himself says, that you're not supposed to make any changes because each change comes from a shevet. And because of this, the Chasam Sofer really, really doesn't like this. He says, Lai Havanti, I don't understand what you're telling me. He says, if this is so, that all these nuschayos are only, this nusach sfarad is only built for those who don't know what nusach they're supposed to be, but someone who knows is supposed to daven a very particular nusach. Says Kohanim and Leviim who know what shevet they're from, they shouldn't daven this nusach. They should daven the nusach that they know. He says, "V'oid tzarich li'iyin gadol haloi b'meichach meishas kvar nesarvu." The bilbul, the irvuv in what shevet we belong to happened way, way before the Arizal. It happened thousands of years ago during the Meichach Me'ashas. And Kiyam HaKayanim V'Aleviim, with the base Rabbi Vanasim, very few families really still knew who they were. They had specific yichas. And Kain, Kulam Espalus Svardas, Uminayan Lonu B'nei Goyla Shachar Shas Nuschayos Acheres. If you're going to tell me that according to this, that means that all of them daven Nusach Sfarad because they didn't know who they were, so then when did all the rest of the Nuschayos get invented? And the Chasam Sofer knows that for thousands of years, Klal Yisrael is davening all sorts of different Nuschayos throughout the Deiros. You can't tell me that during the Yemei HaShas they daven Nusach Sfarad, and then 15 other Nuschayos were invented after that. He says, V'iner Rav Eliezer HaGadol him debanav shel Moshe Rabbeinu. Rav Eliezer HaGadol was an anikel of Moshe Rabbeinu, like the Medrash Rabbah in Parshas Chukah says, and Rav Akiva was his Talmud, who was from the Bnei Gerim, which we know from Chazal, and still the Gemara in Tainus and Daf Chafayim and Beis tells us that Rav Akiva was the Chazan by Rav Eliezer's minion. He says, Eich Yachalias Shluchas Rav Eliezer Shal Kol Bnei HaKnesses Ahuvu Eina Mehem Ve'Ech Nasa Shlucham. If you're going to tell me that every version, every Nusach has to have its own way, how could he have been a chazan for them? And along this vein, the Chasam Sofer continues, and he says, Mamela, I have a very big problem, he says, and we have to be machzik in our Messiah. I don't understand such a thing. It's impossible to say this. And I don't know what you're talking about. He says to the Yismach Moshe and to the Mizrach Magid. And Mamela, the Chasam Sofer himself, daven Nusach Sfard until his dying day. I'm sorry, I take that back. I'm sorry. Daven Nusach Ashkenaz all the way through. And until some of the branches of his family became Hasidish, maybe there were some changes in certain branches, but Be'etzim, the Chasam Sofer and his Talmidim and his children, daven Nusach Ashkenaz, because the Chasam Sofer said, I don't understand. I don't know what to make of this. Now, the problem is that the Chasam Sofer is asking kashas on all these basic building blocks, and this is something that can't sit if you're going to daven Nusach Sfard. So there's many rebuttals to the Chasam Sofer, and I guess the Iker I want to share the Iker ones. We'll leave obviously we could talk about this for hours and hours. There's so many pratim. Let's sample a little bit from the Divrei Chaim's tshuva in Or Chaim Chelik Beis tshuva Ches, which is a long tshuva, and the Ramshik in Or Chaim Sim Mem Gimel, who's the Chasam Sofer, is one of the Chasam Sofer's primary Talmidim, who rebuts the Divrei Chaim's questions on the Chasam Sofer almost point for point. So let's go to the Divrei Chaim and Simchas and see how he deals with the Chasam Sofer's full frontal attack on the origin and the sources and the underpinning of Nusach Sfard. So the Divrei Chaim starts off and he says like this. He says, Tshuva. Hein emes, the Gam Nusach Ashkenaz will be soid, the Commission before the Divrei Ariyah Kadosh, Kavanasa Nusach Ashkenaz, Kamei Kadosh Yoyin Sham. He says it's true what the Chasam Sofer is saying, that even Nusach Ashkenaz, stims with the Kavanas and has Soidis Ne'elam in it. Okay, of course it's true. That's true. And he says, and the truth be told, that not all of Nusach Sfard is actually Sfard. A lot of it's Ashkenaz. And then he brings as follows. He says, and he brings the same thing that the Chasam Sofer is quoting, that the Magen Avraham quotes, that there are 12 Sharim connected to Shvatim, he brings that raid. He brings that Rizal v'chulu, and then he says, you see from that Rizal that each Shevet has a shar for himself. Every person is supposed to be matching to the Sheirish Nafshay, me'ez Shevet he's from. The Chasidim lo yadu Sheirish Nafshay, royal lahachzik b'nusach Arizal, Hari the Kavanas Divrei Arizal, the Birer Hasailas Mitecha Eichel V'Metoken L'chol Nefesh. Now, this is a little bit of like sleight of hand. He brings the Akdama from Pri Etz Chaim in Akdama the Shara Tefillah, where the Rav Chaim Vital writes that you're not supposed to change the schayis because every shevet has. And then he says in Memela, what the Mishnah Chasidim says, that Arizal was Masakim, if everybody doesn't have a Nusach, is self-explanatory. It's like a little bit like, and this is what the Chasam Sofer was asking, it's a little bit hard to disasser. It's Mezoyif Mitoichai. You say, every shevet has its own, Memela, every shevet, everyone should do the same. It's a very, like, Tarti Disasri. So says the Divrei Chaim, that the proof in the pudding is that the Arizal himself, he says the Arizal was an Ashkenazi, and he says, Sherubai, Roiv of the Tefillah of Kavanas Ari, is I'll say the Tefillah Sasfarad, and Latakan Tikkun Atzarech Lamaila. So you see clearly, Harei Deloy Kula Nusach Sfarad, he made changes, he mixed and matches. You see that the Arizal was Raku Birer Hasailas. He was explaining what the perfect synthesis, the perfect blend of Nusach HaTefillah was, and he was creating a new Nusach for anyone who's doesn't know which part of Klal Yisrael he's from. Now it goes without saying that the rebuttal to that is simple. The Arizal was giving over Nusach HaTefillah for his Talmud of Chaim Vital, who was a Svardi and was primarily davening Svard. What the Arizal himself davened and did he actually create a new Nusach is far from certain. Which again the Chasam Sofer says in his two Tshuvas, and many others point this out, and the Maramshik will circle back to this. We'll get to this as well. Now, then he says this that the Chasam Sofer doesn't like what it says in Likutei Amarim from the Mizrach Magid. He says Bechina Misra Chasam Sofer Likutei Amarim. V'ulei machmas, and this is a funny line. He says V'ulei machmas shemechaber roish kahal Chasidim. Could be because the Chasam Sofer didn't like that the Mechaber, the Magid Dvar of Yaakov, the Likutei Amarim was the Mizrach Magid, who was the roish kahal Chasidim. L'chein leinichnasu Dvar ba'azin. The Chasam Sofer could not accept these words from the Mizrach Magid. Ulam tamani al gadol adar rashke b'hagan the Chasam Sofer ech nishpat mimenu divrei Arizal v'akdamas Pri Etz Chaim shekasav kein v'chein mishlas Chasidim shegadol b'negel v'nister kasav kein sheyesh yud beis chalenis neged yud beis shvatim v'chein es vashes b'chol sefer mekwalim. Again, he does this thing where he writes as if the Arizal himself says that you're supposed to change into one if you don't know which one you're part of. The Chasam Sofer is just being literal. The Chasam Sofer says the Kisvei doesn't say anything about changing for everybody. It just says there's 12. And the Divrei Chaim keeps circling back and saying, as if it's Mefurish in the Arizal, that the Arizal holds you're supposed to change. Now, then he asks, this is a valid kasha. He says, this that the Chasam Sofer brings from the kasha with Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer from the Gemara in Tainis Taf Chafei, how is Rabbi Akiva able to let it be the Chazan? He says, I don't understand. That's not a question on the Mezritch Magid. That's a question on the Arizal himself, on the idea that there's 12 chalonis. And if you want to ask that as a kasha, the 12 chalonis, then you're arguing with the Arizal. Obviously, the Chasam Sofer doesn't mean to argue with the Arizal, that everybody held of, the Beis Yosef, the Ramah, the Alshich, the Taz, the Shach, the Magdavarm, they all held of the Arizal. How can the Chasam Sofer arguing him? That's what he asks. Now, the Chasam Sofer, that, in regards to that, I'm not sure what the rebuttal is. The Chasam Sofer is asking a kasha. And then he continues on, he says, and this is probably what the Chasam Sofer would say, is, I'm not even sure what the kasha is. Mechatesa, a chazan can't be moitzi someone else if they're not exactly of the same flavor. Meaning, who says that just because Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Akiva come from different shvatim or have different origins and their tefillos need to go through different sha'arim, that they can't be moitzi each other? Maybe Rabbi Akiva daven Nusach Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Elazar daven Nusach Rabbi Elazar, but Rabbi Akiva could be moitzi Rabbi Elazar even if he's davening his own Nusach. He says, Mechatesa, that can't work. He says, and then he continues a long time on that vein about Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Elazar. And therefore he says, L'chein kol divrei hatshuva hazais nifla umisha nafsha yafa yachal lismach l'gdei adar kadosh yali and shishin nusach ashkenaz l'nusach sfarad. Mainly he says, I don't understand this whole tshuva from Sefer. To me, I don't understand it. And someone who wants to be seimach on the kadosh yali, i.e. the Rebbes of the Darius prior, and he wants to be seimach to change from nusach ashkenaz to nusach sfarad, he's allowed to ve'eni chas v'shalom kechelik amar rashke v'hag chas v'shalom. And I'm not chas v'shalom. He says ve'eneni chas v'shalom. I'm not chas v'shalom arguing in the Chasam Sofer. I don't even know the Sichas Chulun of the Chasam Sofer. Rak masher reisi v'kibaltim pekdoshei elyon gedolim benigla benester amarti Hashem v'tay v'yancheni b'derech ha'emes. He says achar kol zois kasafti zeh. He says matzasi b'Yerushalmi Roshani brings something else from Rakiv, another thing, and then he brings that basically. Let me just get to that part. He says he ends off with this la'achar shenoches ir v'kadosh min Shemaya. HaBaal Shem Tov. A heilige malach came down from Shemayim and the Baal Shem Tov. Asher gadloi mevor b'sefer Yachon u'boyez la'goyin bal meir nesivim. His greatness, the Baal Shem Tov's greatness, is already delineated in the Sefer Meir Nesivim. Sheheyed al goydel k'tushasev v'nefloisav v'chein shem ha'gedolim siper b'shvachai v'kama goyinim kadmoinim sheyidu shemin hashamayim nishlach l'taken doiroi. The Baal Shem Tov was sent from heaven to fix his dar v'haven, and he understood. Now here's the punchline. Now, so the very chassidish approbation, he doesn't, he says the Baal Shem Tov was grace because everybody says he was grace, and he says the Baal Shem Tov came down v'haven and he understood shesherish nishmasoi eina mishar nusach ashkenaz. The Baal Shem Tov understood with his great Havana that the sherish of his neshama was not the Ashkenaz, it was not an Ashkenazi sherish. U'lechein achaz b'nusach Arizal. V'gam ra he saw shemizmanei ve'elach, from his time and on, Kama nefashim sheruyim lachas b'nusach hari, that there were many nefashis that would be better suited to be eichas in the nusach harizal. Ulezet tikkun sheyispal anoyig machar b'nusach harizal, and that's why he was misakin that those who come after him should have a nusach harizal. V'chein hinig achar of Rashi Adair Sektoshim Talmidav Talmidav Ga'inim Gedolim Benigla Minister, all the Talmidim, the Gracie Rebbe, who followed him. L'chein Kalam Maimin v'Baal Shem Tov b'Talmidav. Anyone who believes in the Baal Shem Tov v'Talmidav, and this is an interesting sprach, an interesting choice of words, Kalam Maimin b'Baal Shem Tov v'Talmidav, which we spoke once in the past about the Archaim HaKadosh, the Divrei Chaim's long tshuva about that. It's a similar vernacular that the Divrei Chaim is employing. It's a Amunas Chachamim Kipshuta, like a Chayvas Amunas Chachamim Kipshuta. Again, some very important underpinning of Chassidish theology over here. It says, Kol HaMaimin b'Baal Shem Tov v'Talmidav roi lachas b'nusach harizal u'minei lo yaziyah. Divrei Shval HaMatzev Nichnel Talmidei Baal Shem Tov l'havin dvar v'akdoshim, and he signs off. This is Rav Chaim Tzanzer. So the Rav Chaim writes this whole long rebuttal to argue in the Chasam Sofer. I'm just saying over the Chasam Sofer's point, the Rav Chaim's points, v'hashayfet yishpat, meaning the truth is that it's already a settled thing, and today there's different cries that do different ways, and it's something that's in the rearview mirror. But each one's argument stands on its own weight, and the Chasam Sofer truly makes some very, very valid points. And from a purely halachic standpoint, and Ramosha reiterates this in a much later tshuva that we're not going to go into, and Rabbi Vadia talks about it in his own way, there really is not much acceptability for changing the schayas. And the Rav Chaim explains it's more of a chassidish concept, a kabbalistic concept, based on a Messiah b'shem Nusach Magid, that in our dar the Baal Shem Tov felt that this was not the appropriate nusach hatfilah for these neshamas, and he made these changes. Now comes along the Maram Shek, in a long tshuva, and he goes through point by point to argue with the Divrei Chaim in defense of his Rebbe, and he starts off bringing what is basic, and he says as follows. He says, Ani lo basi la'achriya lahachnes reishi ben ahar magdalim. Chas v'shalom gam yadati ki ein anochi kedai la'achriya. He says, I'm not coming to settle an argument between the Chassam Sofer, who was the Gadol Adar, and the Divrei Chaim was, another tremendous Gadol in his Dar. I can't. Rak even shirami tech dvarav shedivrei mar and hagoyin bal Chassam Sofer zal mukshim u'mufrachim. I saw that in the Divrei Chaim's eyes, the Chassam Sofer's words are shver and agishlagin. V'nisvatlu dvarav mikayach harayis eilun. He's mevatl his words. L'zois matzasi atzmi mchuyiv levar advarim. I have to explain to him the Chassam Sofer's rationale. He called dvarav nemarim be'emes misher. Everything that the Chassam Sofer says in this tshuva is said with truth and yashrustik and glatkite. Then he starts off with the halachic part of it first. He says, V'hinei, Hamagen Avram, b'simin samaches, hevi ha-Yerushalmi, it's a Yerushalmi in Erevin in the third parak, shesholchu mitam, they sent a message, afal gav, shanu sholchum lechem nusach hatfila, even though we're sending you nusach hatfila, and there's a bit of a girsa dispute in this Gemara, in this Yerushalmi, but putting that aside, afal gav, shesholchu lechem nusach hatfila, al teshanu miminig mekoimchem. And it's gebracht from the Sefer Kabbalah, and the Magen Avram brings this down, that there are 12 shvilin, and you're not supposed to change. The Magen Avram that we quoted many times, Magen Avram in Siman Samaches, he says as follows, I'll read you the Lashon, he says, Ariza aloiha yo'emer piyutim u'pizmainim, elamashe siddur rishonim, kagana kaliri, sheneskablo derech ha'emnes. Amma menhagim shenagu b'shrashay atfila, this that there's various menhagim in the shrashay atfila, ein l'shanis minig b'kaimi. No one should change from how his minig is. Ki yud beis sha'arim b'shamayim, there are 12 shvilim in the Shemayim, neged yud beis shvatim, keneged yud beis shvatim, chol shevet v'shevet yesh l'shar or minig, each shevet is a shar or minig, levad ma shenizker b'gemara shav l'chol. Except for the things like Shemana Esrei that are nizker in the Gemara that are shav l'chol. V'zel l'shayin the Gemara Yerushalmi, the Magen Avram quotes the Yerushalmi, afal pish sheshalchu l'chem say the tefillas, al teshanu minig avisechem. The Pri Megadim, half an art, in Siman Samaches, they writes, the Mehasam, from these words that the Magen Avram is bringing, B'Shem the Kisvei Arizal, the Mehasam Muchach, the Ein L'Shanas Minusach Ashkenaz, L'Nusach Sfarad. From here is Muchach, that you're not supposed to make any changes. B'Nusach Atfila, Ein L'Shanas, he says, you're not supposed to make any changes, like the Magen Avram says. So brings the Maram Shik, that this is Kilo Pasha da Halacha, and V'chein B'Emes Muchach L'Chol Raya, and it's very shver, Mashehevi, V'Tema Rabba, L'Goyin Misan Zatzal, Echiskim L'Hapach, the Mutter L'Shanas. How did the Goyin Mitzans see this open shot information and conclude from it something that's the opposite? And this is the most important taina on the Divrei Chaim's tshuva, is that the source material that the Chassam Sofer is bringing really bears out what the Chassam Sofer is saying. He says in Ramela, the Chassam Sofer said it was shver. How could you change Yunus Chayes? And the Chassam Sofer wrote about his own Rebbeim and etc. Now, so he says, Valzeh Shavmar and Zatzal, the Chassam Sofer says that Nusach Tefillah, Nusach Sfarad, Nusach Ashkenaz, they're really all the same, Sfaradi and Ashkenaz. The Arizal, who was either Sfaradi or had Sfaradi Talmidim, more explicitly spoke out the Kavanas for Sfaradi Tefillah, but Ashkenaz Batzim has it also, and there's no reason to change. You have it all in there, even whether you know it, B'yodim or B'lo Yodim, you have it all in there. And then he says, Memela, the Magen Avram, who L'shitase and Siman Tafresh Tzadik Tes, allows you to make changes, Heichad in Ishtana Inyan, doesn't allow you to make a Shinei Aminig over here, because there is no Shinei Inyan. The Tefillah stays the same, the Kavanas are all there, everything's built in. Then he says as follows. He says, this that the Divrei Chaim brings, that the Arizal himself made some changes, he says, Ani eini mevin shum hasarga b'zeh. The Badai ikar atfila shel nusach Sfarad hiniach Arizal. The Arizal really left everything more or less like an actual Sfaradi Siddur. Rak shehoisiv miktzas dvarim k'til atakinu liyafas advarim shiu yafin tvei. He just made some minor edits and tikkunim to make it even better. Meaning just fixing up a pre-existing nusach, that's just an editing job. An editing job is not a shinei of a minig. The Arizal was just editing. There were certain minor imperfections that were in the Nusach HaTefillah that he was giving over to Rav Chaim Vital, and he made edits. Big deal. What does that have to do with making a shin in his chayes? And he says, Weiter, he says, this to the Chassam Sofer, I'm sorry, 1 second. Then he says, Mitam zay gamani tameh, Amasha Kasav Gam Agoin Misans with the Rechaim Sheichle Nevish Lachalek Al Devi Ariya Kadosh Shad Devi Kabbalah. He says, how could the Chassam Sofer argue on the Arizal? He says, Vani Eni Mevin Miu Achalek Al Devi Kabbalah. Who's the one who's arguing on the Devi Kabbalah? Miu Chash Yosel Devi Kabbalah. Rabbeinu Hai Goin Bal Chassam Sofer Zal Kashi Gadul Lachol Tamida Befratik Rakasavti Shigam Bakdam Sefer Brias Chaim Vorikain. He says, I don't understand. It's like the pot calling the pot calling the kettle calling the pot black. He says the Chassam Sofer is bringing from the Kisvei Arizal. He's bolstering it and he's agreeing with it. You're the one, he says, who's changing the pashtus, the meaning of the Arizal. And then you say the Chasam Sofer is arguing in the Arizal when he asks a kasha on your new interpretation of the Arizal with the Shvilin. He says, "V'nahirna." He says, "I remember Kazachisi Lomud b'Yeshiva Yitzhar Rabbeinu Hakadosh Baruch Baal Chasam Sofer when I learned in Yeshiva. Shemati mimenu binyan say that tefillah shu mechuven neged adal elamis abiyah shu rashi tevis asher yeshvesechi aluch." He says the Chasam Sofer was very chosh for Kabbalah, and he brings a few tzirufei yosiyos that the Chasam Sofer made about the kavanas tefillah. He says, of course, the Chasam Sofer knew very much the kabbalistic elements of tefillah. And the Chasam Sofer felt that he was the Adrabah, he was the one adhering to the Arizal's words, and therefore he says you have to stick to the Nuschayos as are and not change them at all. Then he goes off, he digresses into a few more Kabbalistic elements that the Chasam Sofer taught the Talmidim about Tefillah. He says, "V'al kolpanim divrei maran agoyin zalheim mechuvanim umaskimim im sefer hakavana shevi Magen Avram." The Chasam Sofer's words are richtig and very much in sync with the words of the Magen Avram. V'mdvar m'vavam sham sefer Divrei Chaim b'shem Pri Eitz Chaim mechuvanim l'dina. He says then, it's a few more details. Okay, whatever, the rest of it, he goes into like the details of what who the Arizal was, etc. He goes to deal with that kasha with Rebbe Elazar and Rabbi Akiva, the Divrei Chaim's terutzim, v'chulu. In the end, Chasam Sofer comes out saying, "Kol zeh kasafti levar l'chashamar na'goyin zal leitah chas v'shalom." All this I wrote just to prove to you that chas v'shalom the Chasam Sofer did not make a mistake. V'lehiviu shum stira kenegda. In this, that all the Divrei Chaim's kashas don't raise even an element of question against them. Hanira lefiyani nestaiti kasafti v'leachriya rak levar divrei Rabbeinu zatzal. And then he signs off. Now, so there's so much more, many teshuvas from the Gedolim, Chasidim and Misnagdim, who wrote back and forth to elaborate and continue on this long machlekes between the called Chasam Sofer and the Divrei Chaim and the Ramshik, and the Minchas Elazar wrote tshuva about it, and it continues, and Rav Moshe and Rav Vadia and others. But I think this gives us a flavor of the halachic elements of the machlekes of the Shina and Nusach, Nusach Sfar and Nusach Ashkenaz. By today, like we said, it's already, so to speak, a settled din, and every kehila does their way, and every person does their way, and still, I think it's not advisable for one, to change his Nusach willy-nilly, even today, that the halacha still holds true, obviously, but by and large, the changes have been made ready, and we're now not in a very, a very big time of change. Everybody kind of davens the way they daven. And this is just to give a flavor to the actual sides of this machlekes, and I think we'll probably move on to another topic.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.